Interest groups, lobbying, money and politics. What are your feelings here? I think you're likely picturing politicians accepting wads of cash and getting a little bit too chummy with Chad from Goldman Sachs, slapping each other on the back over $90 cocktails in some New York cigar bar. You probably hate it. You think it's corruption, you think that elites are bending the system to their will. And you wouldn't be alone. Some 73% of Americans would, very roughly speaking, agree with you. And even lobbyists themselves would agree to some extent. In the UK, 9 out of 10 think that more transparency is needed in their own sector. But a large minority of people and groups absolutely love lobbying. Of course, there's the usual suspects like industry associations and tech giants and Big Pharma and Mitch McConnell, but you've also got a motley crew of various other groups who love lobbying. Grassroots non-profits, public health groups, municipalities, criminal justice reformers, climate groups. All of these groups and people claim that lobbying is a force for good, that it allows people to band together and be heard in a way they couldn't be heard as individuals. So this is all a bit confusing then. Are lobbyists the spawn of Satan or champions of the small folk? It's a big question, I have to be honest. And before I pass any judgment, let me first take a step back and talk about why we allow interest groups and lobbyists to operate at all. Here's how lobbying happens. Let's say that you and me just got a little bit tired of our daily jobs, so we decide to start a side hustle, like everybody does these days. We decide to make homebrew IPA. So we open up a little microbrewery, start brewing beer, but then we realize that it's actually bloody hard to make a profit. We think that having a tax break would be pretty nice, so we decide to badger our local political representative to sort us out. But unfortunately, between the jobs and tasting beer and taking care of our kids, there's just no time for all of this. So we decide to scrape together our last bits of money and hire a professional. Now this pro-lobbyist knows his way around. He can think about policy details, he can badger politicians, he knows which doors to knock on. He's got it all, and he's way more effective than both of us put together. So lobbying is not a bad thing then, right? It's a win-win-win all around. We get to brew beer, we get our tax break, and the politician gets to claim that he passed some legislation that helped the local industry. But hang on a second. This politician surely knows that our lobbyist has got a bit of an agenda, so why would he listen to him? The real reason why he would take advice from our lobbyist, and all other lobbyists in fact, is because lawmakers are spread paper thin. The average US Congress member has got about 15 staff or so, which sounds like a big team, but when you consider the fact that they've got to represent some 760,000 people, and they have to consider and vote on thousands of complex bills every single year, it's almost like being there on your own. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a junior congresswoman, congressman, MP, whatever. Just yesterday you were still drilling people's teeth for a living in Bitchfield, Lincolnshire, and then you decided to run to fix the miserable state of healthcare in your area. Now it's 2 months later, you are in Westminster or Washington DC, and you're expected to be wheeling and dealing and getting stuff done. But your whole team consists of Tim, who's a pasty lad in his early 20s, who can barely string together an email. And your constituents keep spamming you with requests daily. You've got dozens of emails and angry calls and letters that you need to respond to. And on top of that, you don't really know how the legislative process works. You've got no idea how to draft bills and get support for them. So you're feeling a little bit despondent. And then one day, in front of your office, you bump into this guy. He's got ceramic teeth and expensive shoes, and he looks a little bit on the slick side, but he seems nice enough. You start chit-chatting about the weather and how you're doing and what you're up to, and finally you confide in him that you're struggling a little bit. He seems really understanding. He says, "Oh yeah, I've met lots of MPs like you," and he offers to get you settled in. And over the next several weeks he takes you golfing, invites you to a few health policy conferences, and after a while you realize that he's actually with a think tank. He's not too shy about it, and he goes, "Look, I just want what's best for you. I've got the connections, I've got the know-how, I can help you draft your healthcare policy. I can link you up with people in the pharmaceutical sector, I can link you up with the top NHS officials, and I can do it all for free. So, do you accept his offer knowing that he's got an agenda? Or do you decline, risk not getting anything done, and not getting re-elected? This is how most lobbying actually happens. It's about overworked legislators taking any bit of help that they can get. They know that lobbyists are biased, but they've got expertise and they can help draft bills and pass bills, and that makes voters very happy because you look busy, and it's really good to look busy if you want to get re-elected. So that's one way that lobbying happens. But lobbying is not just about helpful think tankers providing their expertise and opinions and services for free. Away from the prying eyes, a lot of shenanigans can take place. Here's an example of just such wheeling and dealing. Have you ever heard of Eric Lipton? This guy won a Pulitzer back in 2015 for an expose on how US state attorneys general were courted by energy companies and law firms. It turns out that these firms flew attorneys general out to resorts, gave them campaign donations, etc., and in return, predictably, these attorneys general dropped investigations, changed policy. It was basically back scratchers all around. He also uncovered that some dozen-plus state attorneys general were working in secret with oil and gas companies. They gave campaign donations to attorneys general in return for influence on the Environmental Protection Agency. The companies drafted pressure letters verbatim that were then signed by the attorneys general. Lipton's reporting also uncovered that biased bill drafting was absolutely pervasive. In West Virginia, the Attorney General championed regulations written by coal lobbyists against the clean air rules. And quite predictably, the regulations, of course, passed. His reporting also found that regulations against gift giving were routinely circumvented. Companies reimbursed various conferences that were basically just schmoozing sessions with a bunch of lobbyists. The companies also pumped money into think tanks to flood the marketplace of ideas with biased reports. Now you might say, that ain't no evidence of systemic issues, that's just anecdotes. I'd say that attorneys general in a dozen-plus states, that's a pretty strong sample, but whatever you say, well. Bad actors are always around. We got strong rules. Don't you know about the Lobbying Disclosure Act of '95 and the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007? You gotta register, you gotta submit reports to the government, you gotta post your travel history, there ain't no gifts you can give. You can't so much as fart in this country without some pencil-neck bureaucrat asking for a report. Well, I'd say that's not enough. Because these regulations have got plenty of loopholes. Here's an example. Do you recall the Dodd-Frank Act? It was the big deal meant to rein in the financial industry after 2008. But some 10+ years later, many bits of that legislation are still not implemented. And why is that? It's because financial lobbyists were quietly shaping the federal regulations by influencing agencies. So what's the big fuss here, you might say? Well, it turns out that if you lobby with agencies, then you actually don't need to register as a lobbyist, which means that your actions are not really watched as carefully. You just bundle your political advocacy with more mundane work like contracting and legal advice, and it's off to the races. Luckily, however, a few researchers realized that agencies actually record all their meetings, which means that unregistered lobbying is actually traceable to some extent. These researchers found that such amphibian lawyer lobbyists outnumber actual lobbyists 2 to 1. And it also turns out that rivers of cash are spent in such unregistered lobbying activities. For example, in the banking sector, the entire amount of registered lobbying amounted to some $54 million in 2019. But the actual lobbying spend was at least 3 times, if not 20 times as much. Now, there's an asterisk here, of course. By definition, undeclared lobbying isn't measured, but it can be estimated from the general legal expenses of these big banks, which on average seem to spend about $1 billion per year, by the way. And with some clever statistical analysis, you can coax out these unregistered lobbying figures. Now, I think that these examples just go to show how bloody easy it is to skirt regulations. And I could go on and on and on about this. For example, there is this paper, and this paper, and this other paper, and this other paper, and there's probably more. There's only one conclusion here. If you're a lobbyist, the world is your oyster. Still, while lobbying sometimes deserves the dark reputation it's got, it's not all-powerful. Sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it is actually used for good. First, let's look at the limitations of lobbying. It turns out that well-funded industry advocates don't always get their way. Research shows that municipalities and government agencies are much more effective at lobbying than industry bodies. In California, bills often have sponsors. Sponsors are groups of people and individuals who helped draft these bills. Now, some clever researchers looked at the historical record of bills in California and found that bills that have got government agencies or municipalities as sponsors tend to pass at a 68% rate. That is much higher than the 56% rate for bills that are only sponsored by industry bodies. Research also shows that lawmakers trust their staffers more than lobbyists, which at least shows some good amount of common sense. And research also shows that calls from voters are more effective at swaying legislators than calls from lobbyists. The second point is that lobbying is not always nefarious. The point of view of the industries that are being regulated with a certain law should always be heard. Let's only think about the electric car sale mandates in the EU and the UK. Now, all petrol cars are supposed to be swapped out by, 2030 or 2035, which seems about feasible, though less so than it used to, I think. But if you imposed legislation that mandated swapping out petrol cars, let's say tomorrow, it just wouldn't be possible. Industry lobbyists are experts. They understand the implications of laws being passed, and without their input, it's easy to end up in a world where our laws are just not feasible or too complicated or full of contradictions. And this is really bad for everybody, because then every company needs an army of lawyers just to do their day-to-day business. Besides slowing everything down, it's also really bad for new players in the market. If you're a startup of 2 people, you just don't have the budget to hire a legal team of 10. And let's not forget, policymaking is not a particularly popular business among the voters. They generally prefer to avoid the conflict and debates and compromises that policymaking usually entails. Voters are also generally relatively ignorant about policy, which is fine. People have other stuff to do in their life. They can't be bothered to take on a full-time job passing bills. But there is always an engaged minority within the society, and lobbying seems to be a good way to channel their energy to productive ends. For example, the AARP in the US, which is a kind of retiree association, kicked up a massive fuss back in 2022 when Biden's Build Back Better Act left out some important drug pricing reforms. The AARP mobilized legions of pensioners literally overnight and blitzed the Congress with some 400,000 communications like emails and calls and ads and petitions, and quite quickly they achieved their goal. They negotiated drug pricing reforms, which gave Medicare more power in negotiating drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. Alright then, so first you're yanking me in one direction saying lobbying is all bad and nefarious, and now you're yanking me in the other direction saying that lobbying's actually pretty good. So which is it? What is the TLDR here? Let's try to wrap this up then. Point number 1. There is too much money in politics. While the direct lobbying figures look pretty small, the actual spending is way bigger than that, because interest groups find ways around the regulations around lobbying and spend 3 to 20 times more than declared. The second thing to remember is that bad behavior is pretty frequent and tends to happen away from the limelight. Not in Congress, not in the Senate, but in state legislatures and obscure agencies and so on. For example, the US State Attorneys General dropping investigations after funded retreats and various donations from industry interest groups. This is literal services for sale kind of stuff. However, we should keep in mind that most lobbying influence is actually pretty soft. It's about think tanks and lawyers providing free advice and helpful policy papers and free expert opinions and tweaks to bills. Also, politicians usually don't really trust industry lobbyists. They prefer to listen to their own staffers and voters. But the problem is that politicians who write laws and pass laws are spread paper thin. Their teams are small and consist of inexperienced staffers, meaning there's a vacuum of expertise and bandwidth. Enter the slick lobbyist with access to donors and his talking points and ready-made bills. It's really hard to say no to help when your inbox is on fire and re-election is in a year and you haven't really got much to show for it. We've got to remember, passing bills is political capital. The TLDR of TLDR is, dodgy lobbying practices are an issue, but the real problems are the lack of transparency and the lack of public attention. If the biggest weakness of the current system is that a lot of stuff happens behind closed doors in dankly lit rooms, what we need to do is to open the door and shine some light in there. There are a few ways to go about this. The first thing is we can implement better regulations. In the US, the existing coverage is already pretty wide. For example, all campaign contributions need to be made public, all gifts to politicians above a certain threshold need to be disclosed, all meetings need to be logged, and there's even a revolving door cooldown period of 2 years, meaning that if you used to be an office holder, you now have to wait 2 years before you can join the other side. However, this system is full of exemptions and loopholes, as we've seen, and we really need to close them. But apart from this, there's an even better solution. We should hire more policy staffers for lawmakers. Regulations are a game of cat and mouse. You implement regulations, the industry finds ways around them, you implement new regulations, and the cycle continues. But with more policy staffers, you simply get to cut out a lot of the biased influence that lobbyists bring. We should also turn being a policy staffer into a viable career choice. Let's not have any more barely legal staffers who arrive in Washington, D.C. or Westminster at the age of 22 and then leave at the age of 25 or 26 after their boss has been kicked out of office. Currently, we're losing a lot of expertise this way. Instead, we need to hire these staffers and put them into committees so they stick around for longer, for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. This way, we can train professionals who can write laws that work. I know you might say, more deep state and evil government. Okay, I know. But think about this. If you're a policy staffer, you've got no incentive to draft laws that line your own pockets because it's really difficult for you to cash out. This is very much unlike industry lobbyists. Also, hiring more staffers is not even that expensive in the grand scheme of things. For example, in the US, $2 billion were spent on running the House and the Senate combined in 2013. Why not make that 2.5 or maybe 3 billion? If this sounds like a lot, remember that the overruns on the new Sentinel ICBM program cost some 36 billion last year alone. This was one blunder on one defense project. Compared to military spending, the cost of making our governments more accountable, effective, and transparent costs absolute peanuts. Okay, time to wrap things up. Now, lobbying is fine in principle, but right now the system is a bit of a mess. It runs on loopholes and plausible deniability and is mostly powered by noobs. It's too easy for the industry to tip the scales in its own favor. But we can fix this. There is a way forward and we should take it. If you like this production, subscribe. There's going to be more in the future.